Hi everyone. So this is the lecture for race. This is a fairly short PowerPoint. There are actually in the on some of the slides there are some links to some YouTube videos, so you can go ahead and watch those. And some of the stuff is review. But before we get started, I'll say that so exam 2, those are all graded. You should have received an email from me either with notes in the email or a copy of your exam with notes, on the exam, just like with the first exam. So those are all graded, and the class average was like basically the same as it was for the first exam. So the first exam, your class average was like a B plus. There was like 1% difference. So as a group, you guys are doing really well. Didn't seem like there were any issues. Same issues as always, but I would say that this time you guys did much better at contacting me. So I had a handful of students before the exam was due contact me, wanting clarification on questions, wanting to know if the way they were answering it was correct, wanting to know if they needed to fix anything or change anything. So like that's a huge improvement from the first one. And for those students who did that, there were a few of you. You guys did much better, than you did on the first one. So that's always really great to see that you guys are doing that. And I hope you guys continue to do that and continue to reach out to me if you have any issues, whether it's about the exam or anything else, assignments. As long as you're communicating with me, I'm gonna try to work with you on that. And then of course, if you're taking initiative to do better in the class, and that's awesome. Okay, so back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so we're on slide 2. So recall that this is a little bit of review of what we had talked about before. I think we were talking about human variation. That in this idea of a race versus like what we say in anthropology, this term ancestry, like obviously in anthropology we recognize, especially, considering like, longer trends in evolution, human evolution, that we recognize that people ancestrally are from very specific regions of the world. And for long periods of time, people lived in those areas, enough time for like very specific, morphological adaptations to accumulate. And so we recognize that people clearly look different from each other based on those, ancestral differences because of environment and the evolutionary process. However, this idea of race, the reason we don't use that term, and if you recall, I mentioned this before in that previous PowerPoint, is that this term race historically references this idea called racial typology, that people are distinct and different from each other in multiple ways, whether it's like physical or intellectually or, in terms of religion or language, that they're very distinct and different. And we know that that's not how it works. There's overlap for whatever thing we're talking about, whether we're talking about biology or culture, that there's going to be, overlap for any of those features. You can't make generalized, broad claims about a group of people and then also say like that's true for them and no other group is like that, whether it's like a positive or a negative. So we know that's not how it works. So we use the term ancestry to recognize, yes, people clearly look different based on, environmental adaptations in the past, but recognizing this term race just doesn't really work in terms of like anything like scientific that we're trying to accomplish, whether it's in biological anthropology or cultural anthropology. And so I kind of, mentioned that. And then this is also review in the next slide, just showing you another example of this. So even if we're looking at skin tone, we see it's not as if you look at one part of the world and there's a very specific skin tone and no one else in the world has that skin tone. No, of course that's not it. And this is true for any feature, like I said, biological, behavioral, cultural, that you're gonna see. You can't group people into distinct categories. There's always gonna be overlap and grades, especially things like this, like environmental differences. Okay, slide 4, another review, just to reiterate this to you guys, Bergman's and Allen's rule. So just getting into some of these like, introductory level concepts of how we will look in very general ways, how people will look different based on, where they're from in parts of the world. So just in terms of like body form, whether you're really tall with long limbs or shorter and stockier, just looking at that one feature and looking at just like, like weather conditions, climatic conditions are going to be, that's already going to make a huge difference. And then if you start, compounding that with elevation or food resources, humidity, like the list goes on, and how people, humans, or any other, primate or mammal will look different according to that environment. Especially over long periods of time, you're going to see those distinct differences. Slide 5. So this is just to reiterate, I think, things that you guys are obviously fully aware of. Humans as a group, as a species, we are very diverse. So this is interesting in terms of like comparing us to other primates and mammals. Like, we are a globalized species, which is very rare. Most of the time when you look at a species, when they start, geographically expanding, we see they actually, what we call speciate. They become different, like species or subspecies, because eventually as they grow farther and farther apart, they don't, they're not still interbreeding. I was like, what's the word? They're not, they're not mating it anymore because they're geographically separated. But for humans, that's not the case. Especially like in 2020, we live in a very globalized world. It's very easy to travel. But our whole species, that's not that issue. We're not subspecies. There's not a subspecies of humans. I've heard this before. This is not accurate at all. We are one species. But because we are globalized and we have this really unique, ancestry, that we were a very diverse species, probably one of the most diverse species. Most of the time, like I said, when you see another species that's fairly diverse like that, they tend to become, different species because they're not still interbreeding, and that's not the case with humans. So we are, like I know I've said this before, humans, we're not really unique or special. Like, we are unique and special in our own way, just as every other animal is unique and special in their own way. And this is one of the ways that we are kind of interesting, that we are a little more diverse. So like it also says here on slide 5, race is socially constructed, that we tend to, have this idea that, race is meaningful in this historical sense when we know it's really not. However, obviously, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit in the slide towards the end, people will still use this as a basis for discrimination, and that's not something we can ignore. So why did I write biracial? I'm not sure why I wrote that. Probably just recognizing that the different terminologies we use. And then another term, so we talk about like ethnicity. So like we often, and I think this is mostly from a place of like, we're just trying to be polite. We don't know the correct term, whether we say like ancestry or ethnicity or nationality. In fact, like, I'm sure many of you can relate to this, like getting this question, like, well, a couple questions. One, like, where are you from? Or what are you? Like, both, I mean, one probably a little more offensive than the other, but, like, not every person can relate to that question, but I think many people can, at least probably in some instance of their life that's happened to them, and for some people, it happens a lot. So you might look at me and think, oh, like, she's just some white girl. But, I mean, you probably noticed my hair is not naturally blonde. I'm naturally brunette. My hair is like dark brown naturally. And my skin's fairly light now, but when I was younger, it wasn't. So my father's side is like, they're European. But my mother's side is East Indian and Native American. And then there's some European mixed in there as well. So, and especially when you see me with my mom, like, she clearly looks, like we have similar features, like, obviously because we're related, but there's some distinct differences. But when I was younger, and even now a little older, like, I get that, like, you look different, there's something about you, and I always say I'm Indian. They're like, oh, okay. And then recently I did my, and I was going to mention this to you guys before, and I forgot. I did my 23andMe. Finally, I've been saying I'm going to do 23andMe for like the last, 6 years. I wanted to know how much Neanderthal I had. So I ended up doing it, and like none of it was a surprise, it was like so much percentage European, which made sense, so much percentage Asian, and then it was really cool. Like, they were able to narrow it down to like the very specific regions, and like so I was like, wow, that's like really cool. And was able to match me with some relatives. Some people like on really distant, like, this is a possible fifth cousin. I'm like, I don't know who that person is, but it's still kind of cool. And I was hoping for like a secret family member, so I've had 2 friends, in the last like couple of years who have done 20. I think one of them did 23andMe, one of them did like National Geographic or Ancestry.com, whichever one, and ended up finding out like some crazy family secrets. So I was like kind of hoping for something like, I don't know if it's like something you should hope for, but I was like, no, just regular, well, at least not yet. Maybe my secret, family member will do one later, and then they'll be like, who's this girl? Who's Alicia? But if you were interested, it's actually a really cool thing. I know there are like multiple options for doing this, but 23andMe was like only like $100 if you do like the basic package. So, which is all I wanted, and then I found out I have like just a little less than 2% Neanderthal DNA. It was like 1.8 or something. And I was like, wow, it's like a lot. So that was like really interesting, and you can do, and like of course the scientists in me, like you can do like the surveys, and it'll ask you a bunch of questions, and they use that for their data, and like that's really cool too. So anyway, if you're interested, you have my recommendation. It's really cool, and like the app is it's really interactive, and there's a lot of really amazing visuals, and like even if like it'll give you like this map of like, or give you like a pie chart of like your ancestry, and then it'll show you like the regions, and you can like click on links to like learn about that region, learn about the culture, and like it's just like really, I could spend like all day on it. I haven't had a chance to really like dive into the info, but it's really cool. I forget even why I started talking about that. Oh yeah. So like, but most people like get this question. So I get this question, like I got it like a couple months ago. Someone was like, what? Like I don't want to be rude, but like, where are you from, or what are you? And it's like, well, like I'm from California. Like I was born and raised in California. But I get what they're asking, and this is the point I was going to say. Is like, I think most time, like if you're here and you're an American citizen, they're like, where are you from? You're like, I'm from here. I'm American, or I'm from California, or I'm from New York, or I'm from Texas, or whatever you're from. What they typically are referencing is like, where are you from, like ancestrally. But often, and I'm sure you recognize that some people are coming at you with that question from a very like innocent place. They're just curious, and some people are very obviously have a different motivation behind asking that question. But also like I remember having this conversation with my mom, I don't know, like a few months ago, and I forget what we were talking about, but she was saying something about someone's nationality. And then I was like, well, aren't they like from the United States? Are they American? And she's like, oh, well, that's not what I meant. Or she said something like, well, you know what I mean? And I was like, no, because we often, unfortunately, we use these terms interchangeably, even when they actually have very specific definitions and they mean other things. And I think sometimes you're like, which one do I say? And I think the younger generation is a little more cognizant of the differences. But anyway, so that's why I have here, like if we're talking about like race versus ancestry versus ethnicity, typically, and this is what I was going to say, typically for ethnicity is a reference to ancestry plus a combination of that and the cultural experience. But also like you might have another definition of that, and like the point is like depending on which, if you're talking to a sociologist or an anthropologist or a historian, they might have their own kind of field specific, very specific definition for those terms. But I think in general, they're all, we can kind of agree that they are different terms. But like I said, you might use one slightly different than another. But just understand, like, we have all these different terms, and they do mean something different. Okay, so slide 6. So here I have a list of some YouTube videos. There's a handful. None of them are particularly long. So take, the whatever, I don't know, 10 minutes it'll be to watch all of them. Watch those. I'm not going to watch, it's not a reaction video. Okay, so slide 7. So we talked briefly about this, about hegemony. And I think the lecture on like a culture, but about this idea that for whatever population you're looking at, typically there can be a standard of what's considered like the ideal, or what's considered in this case like the natural state, what's considered better, and typically it's the ruling class, whatever they may be in that particular population. Whatever they are, what they have, what they look like is deemed to be that ideal, and everyone else is kind of trying to strive towards that ideal, even if it's not attainable, for multiple reasons. And so I gave the example before about what we see typically, women of color trying to change their hair, and how often this can be, problematic. I feel like there are so many aspects to this idea. Like, you as a person in the world should be able to do whatever you want with your hair, of course. And if you like a particular style, then you should be able to do that style. It shouldn't matter at all. But obviously, we can still step back and recognize that that there is this push towards, for certain groups to like do certain things a certain way. In fact, I know there have been recently a couple of court cases about this, about women being like either told they will be like fired, or they're being like written up at work because they have their natural hair, and it's deemed to be unprofessional, which is like outrageous. Outrageous, right? So like this is still a thing, and so like we should, you know, obviously be able to recognize that and critique that in some way. So that's what I'm getting at here, that there are, like, as that is an example, which we talked about before, or even this idea of like, you know, whitening your skin. So it's just, you know, like, do you have the right to, you know, change your skin tone if you like a slightly lighter or slightly darker shade? Yes, of course. Of course. However, like I said, you take a step back and start like kind of picking that apart. Like, why do you have that ideal? Why is that a culturally, why is that a cultural ideal? Why does it seem as if one group is trying to look like another group? I mean, we could have a whole topic or a whole PowerPoint about just this specific thing, you know. But just recognize, like, as far as like for this introductory course, recognize that there are often reasons why, and that this is like a concept that that you will have one group who's trying to be like another group in some way, and not because like they're inspired by that group, but there is this cultural standard, or almost like dictation, that everyone has to be like this, everyone has to look like this, everyone has to have these specific items or behave this certain way, otherwise it's deemed to not be acceptable or natural, which is obviously completely ridiculous. So okay, so slide 8, I just have a few examples of, I mean, good Lord, I put a few examples, but we could, like I said, we could have a whole class and talk all semester about racism in the United States. And in fact, as many of you know, and if you go to the next, like, skip slide 9, let's just go to slide 10, you'll see, you know, slide 10 and slide 11, you'll see it's like some of the more recent things. So I'm referencing, so here we have, you know, the issues with Standing Rock, which that was a couple of years ago. I think we're still seeing some updates in that, but now, of course, more recently in the last few years, but definitely more recently with Black Lives Matter, that we're clearly as a population, as a culture, as a generation, multi-generations, recognizing there are some clear problems that we have not been addressing, that we have been masking, that people have claimed have been addressed. And I think this is also the other, like, I mean, it is not my job as your professor to tell you my personal opinion about anything. I just want to tell you the facts of the matter, especially for a science class. But the facts of the matter are, like, we do know that racism is, you know, thriving in the United States. And not just my opinion, multiple scientific studies have shown this to be true over decades. So it's not a surprise that we're finally, you know, starting to see. I mean, people have been fighting against this since forever, but I think we're seeing it more vocal, and with social media now, it's ever present, which, as it should be, to, you know, obviously correct these wrongs and make it right as much as we can, and move towards a better future in that aspect. So okay, and then the slide 12 is just, oh man, slide 12 and 13, just, you know, just just my quick, like, example of, you know, some of the ways we see racism in America. Like, obviously you guys know that this is like 1% of 1% of 1% of 1% of like the examples that we could find. Like, every one of you could, like, Google right now and find probably some horrible examples of racism in America. This is not a surprise to any of us, probably any of you watching this right now, that this is a major issue. So, okay. That's pretty much it for this one. Like I said, you know, kind of just let some of these ideas settle in your mind. You know, most of you are like, this is one of those things in class where, which is why I usually keep this PowerPoint so short, is that in class we end up having great conversations about these last few, especially like Black Lives Matter. The last couple of years, we had some great class discussions on that. We really can't, obviously, because of being remote. So why don't I know I keep offering you guys extra credit, but I'll keep doing it, you know, as long as you guys are learning something. So why don't there be, I'll have extra credit. If you, and I'll make this worth a lot too. Let me think, I'm trying to think on the spot right now. Send me, let's see, I'll make it worth 10 points. And let's see, 1 page double spaced, which is still like 2 paragraphs, not the end of the world. 1 page double spaced. It's like 2 paragraphs. 10 points on just the recent Black Lives Matter movement and just, you know, what it's about, maybe some of the background. And you only have a page, but so just give me, you know, some interesting information. I just want to know that you kind of looked into it, and that's it. Okay, so like I said, I'll give you up to 10 points extra credit. 1 page, double spaced, so about 2 paragraphs, and just on Black Lives Matter, on whatever aspect of it that you'd like to give me. Okay, and so hopefully for you, that's some great extra points. Probably take you all 10 minutes to do this. In fact, probably many of you already have the knowledge. I think most of us are really kind of hyper aware of how this started and who started this and how it's really resonated with us as a culture. So, but anyway, okay, so that's the extra credit. And then this last slide is just a link to the documentary. But I also already had the link to the documentary, that documentary White Like Me. It's already in, like, you know, modules and documentaries, so you shouldn't need to use it, but I just kept it on the PowerPoint. Okay, so that's it, and I will see you guys on the next one.